Well, sometimes in the preaching, the pastor or the preacher will say, well, what's a new way that we can give these people insight into this text? So we try and find some obscure point. We try and flip something so that you go, oh, I've never thought about it like that before. But there are other times you just need to let Jesus say what he says and hope that it has the same effect on you that it had on the people he was talking to. Because it may turn out that what we're experiencing is what they were experiencing. And really, the diagnosis that Jesus offers with the gospel today, if he were doing a poll, that we're not going to have you raise your hands, he would say, how many of you have given up praying? I go, what do you mean, how many of us have given up praying? And he doesn't mean how many of you don't say the Lord's Prayer at bedtime or pray at meals or say a pious prayer in the church. He means how many people have given up prayer because they simply don't see the point, or they don't think that it works, or they just think, I've asked for a lot of things that haven't come to me, so I'm going to stop asking. And that's why Luke says in the gospel today, Jesus gave them a parable so that they would not lose heart. And so connected to this silencing of the voice of prayer, the silencing of persistent knocking on the door of heaven, is also this spiritual malady, loss of heart, another one of our heart problems. And Jesus gives us this parable about an unjust judge, and he's giving it to people who aren't so sure that it makes a difference whether they pray or not. And that's probably some of us in the church. Notice sometimes Jesus is calling us to external action. Go out, love your neighbor, go out, find contact lenses for this guy that has a genetic eye disease, something like that. Other times, Jesus is reminding us we also have to tend our inner life. Sometimes the spiritual work is tending our inner life. And one of the critiques of Christianity, especially in the West, is we spend so much time in the external stuff and neglected the internal stuff that when people were looking for peace of heart, they looked somewhere else because they didn't imagine we had anything that would allow them to have those resources. So they looked to Eastern religions, for example, hoping to find some inner peace. And Jesus is dealing with the inner things today. And it's a reminder that you have to tend your inner life in the same way you tend your outer life. He gives us this image of an unjust judge. And the interesting thing about this parable is Jesus doesn't give us an idealized version of justice. You go all the way back to the ancient sources, and they're always talking about this idea of justice. You go back to the Greek poets before the classical age of Greece, and they talk about if there's just one person in your city who is corrupt in their justice, they will infiltrate and cause everyone else to be contaminated by their lack of justice. And so beware of injustice in your community. This was sort of the idea of the Greek city-state. We took a group of Lutherans to LACMA, the County Museum of Art up in Los Angeles, because they were doing a Lutheran retrospective in honor of the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. So it's very rare that there's anything about Lutheran art, even though we had Lutheran artists. And they had this box of a German prince, and it was something that he kept by his ruling chair, and it had an image from ancient Rome of a father who sentenced his own son to death because his son had committed a crime that was a capital offense. And the German prince kept this by his chair as a reminder that the call to justice is more primary than even my relationship with my own family. This was the story from ancient Rome. And it's a great idea, but anyone who spends 5 minutes in the criminal justice system knows it's really not the way it works. We have our ideals of justice, and then we have what actually happens. And here we have a bad judge. So Jesus doesn't give us an ideal of justice. He gives us something that's familiar. You may remember there was that judge in Pennsylvania that was sentencing juveniles to prison. And every time he sentenced the kids to prison, he got a kickback from the prison owner. This kind of unjust judge. If you haven't heard that story, you could Google it. It's more horrifying than I've even told you. And so we have this man who is vain, and we know he's vain with something coming up. Jesus tells us twice he has no regard for God, and he has no regard for people. So he's not the kind of person you'd want as a judge. And it says there was a woman in his town who was a widow who kept calling out for justice. Now, the thing about widows in the Bible, they were at the bottom of the social hierarchy. It's no mistake that part of the genius of early Christianity was giving people at the bottom of the social hierarchy a special sense of belonging and dignity. There was even a special office for widows in the early church that you read about in the book of Acts, for example. This person has no clout. She's not going to be a campaign contributor. She's not going to be someone that goes, well, I'm going to call a friend of mine and then, we'll get this sorted out. All she has is persistence, and her persistence allows her to transcend the limitations of her social status, and she keeps returning, calling out for justice, calling out for justice. And it says the bad judge finally relents. And the Greek word is, he didn't want her to give him a black eye. That's the word for harassment in Greek. And that's part of his vanity. He goes, you're making me look bad. He doesn't care about justice. He just doesn't want to look bad. So he says, to keep me from getting smacked around by this lady and her constant complaining, I'll grant her justice just so we can put her away. And Jesus gives us this almost comical scene, where justice is granted for all the wrong reasons. And Jesus says, if that's how it works in the world with bad judges, and not all judges are bad, Your Honor. No, you're a good judge. Yes, you're a good judge. Yeah, you have to be careful when you have a judge in the church. No, the judges are great. Jesus says, imagine what it's like to appear before a good judge, a just judge, your Father in heaven. This is why he says, to those who have lost heart, to those who have stopped praying, to those who imagine it makes no difference, if this woman in her persistence can move an unjust man, imagine how your prayers can move a just God. Imagine how God will exchange with you his desires with yours as you enter this communion of conversation, this communion of belonging. And so Jesus says, with this kind of almost sad rhetorical question, when I return, will we find faith on the earth? Will people even believe that their prayers, their words, their knocking on the door of heaven makes any difference at all? Or do we all just get ground down into a kind of hard-hearted cynicism where we go, well, if it makes you feel good, do it, but it doesn't really make a difference? The prayer of the church, persistent in the world, is one of the things that can shake and move history. And we must not lose sight or faith in that. That's why in the book of Revelation, you see the prayers of the church are gathered up into heaven by the angels with great censers like incense, which is a great biblical image. And then God answers and the angels send God's answers to the earth and the earth shakes. So when God answers your prayer, the earth is shaken by God's answer of the church's prayers. Now, one of the interesting things that comes up in this, and one of the little case studies that we get to reflect on this even more, is the story of Jacob in the book of Genesis. Now, if you've been in one of our Genesis classes, you'll know the context of this encounter. Jacob has just narrowly escaped the revenge and anger of his uncle Laban, who had stopped the little family train and had searched all their luggage and was very upset that Jacob had left. So he just got through one encounter with an angry family member. And now that that's done, right in front of him is another angry family member, because Jacob had a lot of baggage, emotional baggage in his family. And finally all caught up with him. And that's his brother Esau. And that's why we see Jacob sending his wife in front of him, sending the kids, sending all the baggage. He's hoping that if Esau is going to tear them down, he'll have to go through all of them first before he gets to Jacob. So Jacob is between an uncle who's mad at him and a brother who's mad at him, either of whom might take his life or take all that he has. And then we find himself on this mountaintop before this potentially murderous encounter with his brother, and he ends up with this wrestling match. And it doesn't say in the book who he wrestles with. It's kind of in Jacob's character. I think it's a funny detail that at the end he says, well, of course that was God. It may have been God. It may not have been God. But of course, if you're Jacob, you say, oh, yeah, it was God. I've wrestled with God. I wrestled God. Whoever he wrestles with has some kind of power, but it's a real struggle. And this is the image that we have with Jacob, is Jacob doesn't just give up and go, well, whatever, it doesn't make a difference. Jacob wrestles all night. Some of those who have given up praying know what it's like to be up at night, awake, anxious, worried about things, worried about people, worried about events in the world. And so Jacob is up all night before he has this encounter with his brother. but he's not passive. He is wrestling with God, and he's wrestling, and in this wrestling and struggling, he gets a new name. And that's where Jacob becomes Israel. And Israel literally means he struggles with God. The very name of God's people ends up, they struggle with God. We struggle with God. This is why the New Testament uses the image of wrestling so much, is oftentimes our encounter with God is like a wrestling match. We're moving and struggling and being pushed and pulling and trying to figure out how it is that we engage with God's will in the world. And there's disappointments and there's triumph and there's, Jacob ends up being injured and Jacob ends up being disabled. He can't run away from his brother through the injury he gets. But he gets a new name that says he struggles with God even all night. The idea is, as spiritual children of Israel, this struggle is yours. Not to just roll over, not to just give up, not to just say, well, what difference does it make anyhow if any of us say any of this? Jacob's wrestling opened up a new perspective, not just for himself, but for his descendants. Jesus's parable reminds us, if an unjust judge can be good, even for the wrong reasons, how much more will God be good for the right reasons? So do not lose heart. Have faith. Trust that the inner renewal of our lives leads to the calling on heaven and heaven answering our prayers. We might say, as vital as it is for us to be doing our service work in the community and the world, it is equally as vital to be tending to the inner places so that our prayer can illuminate and set free so that we can follow God's call more clearly. Indeed, may Jesus find faith, the faith that comes to us in the Holy Spirit. And for those who have lost heart, may you be renewed, knowing the power of God's love and his desire to answer our prayers. Amen.